the victory of the Chinese communists over the nationalists, the Soviet acquisition of atomic weaponry, the Korean War and the Berlin blockade, it all convinced the Americans that they did need some kind of containment-style alliance to challenge Communist China in East Asia, and that's when they moved to sign the ANZSUS Treaty. There are three basic points about this treaty. Firstly, it is and remains the foundational principle for Australian defence and foreign policy. It's been supported by governments on both sides of politics through many different circumstances, and it remains an effective deterrent for Australia in the region. That is to say that any country considering hostile action towards Australia at least has to take the existence of the ANZSUS Treaty in mind. The Vietnam War, the height of the Cold War, the Australia, New Zealand and United States alliance reached a new level of meaning because Australia and New Zealand were the only two countries that contributed freely to the cause in Vietnam. Probably the lowest point in the history of the alliance was the period of the Whitlam government in Australia in the early 1970s, when America, under President Richard Nixon, was so enraged at Whitlam's criticism of American policy in Vietnam, was so frustrated by Whitlam's suggestions for new regional architecture and Whitlam's proposal to basically boot the superpowers out of the Indian and Pacific Oceans, that Nixon gave some consideration to abandoning the alliance with Australia altogether. Now, John Howard invoked that treaty in the wake of the horrific terrorist attacks on New York and Washington DC, and it followed the invocation of the NATO treaty. He said in Washington on that day of fire, as George W. Bush called it, that Australia stood ready to assist the Americans in any way that they felt possible. And of course, after this, Australia joined US-led efforts both in Afghanistan and Iraq, and this, I think, is where you see the real new intensity of the relationship taking shape. It wasn't long after that that a free trade agreement was signed, intelligence links were strengthened, and of course the links, the integration of the Australian military with the US military continued apace. America, through its pivot to the region under Obama, has expressed its desire and its willingness to show resolve in this part of the world and to meet the challenges of a rising China. But the forces that Donald Trump unleashed rippled right throughout the region and caused a sense of alarm and panic about whether or not the United States may have to, at some stage, withdraw. I don't think that will happen, but I do think there will be increasing nervousness amongst American allies about the American commitment and what they can do to actually meet the challenge of a rising China. So far, China has been able to skim influence from US regional friends and allies. America has been powerless in many ways to stop it. A Clinton presidency will have to deal with these forces, and a Clinton presidency will probably demand more of allies like Australia to do some burden sharing and to uphold what the United States and Australia call the principles of a rules-based international order. That will be the challenge.